Dear colleagues and friends, allow me to start in the manner that I have previously planned. Anyone who wants to listen to the discussion and ask some questions can join us later. Let me introduce myself and introduce my co-moderator and colleague. My name is Ekaterina Tyagay. I'm a partner in Pen and Paper Bar Association. I run the Sensitive Matters practice, and I also run the Department of Family Law, one of its kind in Russia. Today it is called the Department of Family and Housing Law, and it mostly focuses on the issues we're going to raise today. This is the Department of Moscow State Law Academy. We got off in Moscow State Law University today. My co-moderator and colleague Charlotte Gunka is a lawyer and associate in the Paris office of White and Case, member of Criminal Law Committee, co-chair of the Crimes Against Women subcommittee. Charlotte came to us from France, from Paris. I sincerely hope that our moderators will give us new insights into the problems discussed today, not only the Russian insights, but also the international experience. And I hope that Charlotte will be sharing with us the experience today. The topic announced earlier has not changed. It is private life, limitations to state interference. The very phrasing is rather wide and can potentially encompass a variety of topics, but for ourselves, we have decided to limit ourselves to the interference of the government into the relationships with the presence of the family, to the issues of violence against society members, to domestic violence as well, both in Russia and abroad, and then later on discuss the role of the government in resolving these issues. Also look at the international experience of solving the same problems that exist everywhere in the world. And I would like to give the floor to my co-moderator Charlotte for an introductory word before we start our active discussion. Charlotte?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ekaterina. Thank you to all the members and organizers for inviting me to speak on such an important and serious topic. And first of all, I would like to say that this is an important and serious topic, not only in Russia, but in every country, no matter the religion or country. For example, yesterday, when I entered the conference center, and this beautiful conference center, and started talking with my colleagues from Spain, from South Africa, from Poland, from the United States, they shared their experience and their ideas on the issues they come across in matters of domestic violence. So we are all concerned about these issues, but the matters of domestic violence are particularly widely spread, and we will be discussing today the state interference, which is interesting, and its role of a key player, because it is the key role of the government to protect its citizens. Ekaterina has mentioned that I am from France. I am from Europe. I'm a citizen of France and Europe. And as you all know, Europe accepted the Istanbul Convention in 2011 on violence against women and domestic violence. All the member states of this convention are to take effective measures to fight and prevent domestic violence. This convention also states that if the government fails, if the society fails to perform its essential duty of protecting its citizens against domestic violence, then it fails to perform its primary function towards its citizens. And in France, we have issues, but we have
конечно же, положительные уже
We have
вещи,
achieved a number of positive
положительные моменты
things.
в законодательстве. В
In
декабре
December
2019 года было
2019,
принято
we
новое
accepted a new
законодательство в
legislation
отношении
in
домашнего
matters of
насилия, но
domestic
также есть,
violence.
конечно же, и те же проблемы.
But we also have
И
issues with
одно из этого
with
то, что
statistics of
касается
those
населения,
women
женщины,
who
которые
have
являются
suffered from domestic
жертвами домашнего
violence.
насилия. Статистика, конечно же, очень разнообразна.
The
Я считаю,
statistics
что
can
это в
be
каждой стране так.
very
Но в том, что
different,
касается
as in
Франции,
every country, but as concerns France, every second women die of domestic violence.
очень женщины умирают от домашнего насилия. В 2019 году также во Франции были большие мощные общественные дебаты в том, что касается домашнего насилия в отношении женщин, но также и детей.
But also children and to some extent
И
men.
в некоторой степени это касается и мужчин.
And I will stop here and
Сейчас предоставляю слово
give the floor
участникам
to the
этого
other
круглого стола.
participants of the round table
Позволю им сказать о том, что
and
они могут
let them
сказать,
express their
но
thoughts and
главным образом мы
ideas. But the
сфокусированы
main
на трех
issue we have to focus on is first, prevention of domestic violence by means of mass media,
также
school
образование в
education,
школах и,
through police and
естественно,
judges,
задействие судей и полиции,
health,
действия полиции,
insurance and other state institutions,
службы здравоохранения, страхования и
any institutions that can help in these matters.
государственные организации, которые также ассистируют в этих вопросах.
Thank you very
Большое
much.
спасибо.
I'm
И сейчас я
giving the floor
предоставляю
to the other
слово
participants,
нашим
and
участникам, и я
I'm
уверена, что это
certain
будет
that they
очень
will be
интересная
that will be a
дискуссия.
very interesting discussion. Dear colleagues, I would like to introduce the speakers of our session today. Many of them are well known, but I would still like to pronounce these honored names and titles. Tatyana Bakuleva, attorney and partner of Moscow Bar Association, Yulova and Partners. Vitaly Kvashis, honored scientist of the Russian Federation, Doctor of Law, Professor, Chief Scientist of All Russian Research Institute of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, expert of the Council of Europe. Anna Rivina, Director of Violence No Center, teacher of the Department of Family and Housing Law of Moscow State Law University, candidate of law, and Olga Savina, partner, advocate, head of restructuring and insolvency practice, Bar Association, Odelex, Moscow, Russia. For our panel today, we tried to find speakers from different spheres. We understand that the topic we have raised has caused much hype and debate all around Russia, which is why we want to hear out different views and standpoints. They can be personal, since every one of us has their own views on the problem of domestic violence and of the active or passive state involvement in solving these issues and interfering into one's private life, as is often the case. But many of us have a professional standpoint on these issues, and I hope that all speakers will have enough time today to share their personal and professional experience, because this is one of the platforms, the platform of one of the biggest Russian criminal legal conferences, where we can discuss the issues out of the scandalous context it has recently appeared in. But in the professional context, with the professionals who also fully understand these issues on a personal level. The first question I would like to address today, and I would like to emphasize the fact that we have chosen open discussion as a format for this topic. There will be no reports read, no statements given. We want to discuss several key, sensitive issues everyone has their opinion on. And I would be thankful to our panel experts if they could answer the questions as they come. And we will be able to moderate it so that everyone has a say, so that you do not have to wait for the opportunity to speak, so that you could take the initiative. Everyone should have a microphone. Me and Charlotte have two. There is one in the audience. We will also leave some time for questions and answers in the end, so that we could exchange opinions and answer some more questions, if those remain. I would like to start with possibly the main question, which stems from the very name of the panel, Private Life, Limitations to State Interference, in the context of domestic violence, a problem the scope of which cannot be overestimated. We understand that every day mass media broadcast new instances of domestic violence, at least in Russia. These problems exist all over the world too. Charlotte has mentioned the Istanbul Convention that Russia did not sign. Among those countries that are expected to sign it and failed to do so are Russia and Azerbaijan. The other European states have long been member states. We had for a long time pretended the problem did not exist, or that the scope of the problem was exaggerated and did not deserve the effort of signing an international agreement which would impose upon the state a whole range of legal mechanisms that would protect the citizens and prevent domestic violence, provide gender equality and form the basis for the prevention itself. Nevertheless, there have been several rounds of discussion of draft legislation on domestic violence, violence prevention. So today we are at the stage when there is yet another draft legislation on domestic and family violence prevention being discussed. One of the authors is my principal, Oksana Pushkina, and we can see that the issue is hotly debated, which is also directly related to the topic of the meeting. The fight with domestic violence can lead to, as the opponents of the legislation claim, to the interference of the government into family matters, which should actually be resolved by the master of the house, because it is up to the family to decide on the resolution of their problems within this closely knit unit. So my first question would be as follows. Dear experts, do you think that introducing a legislation or signing a convention taking a complex of measures to combat the evil of domestic violence is a necessary tool which would be fundamental to fighting domestic violence in one single country or on the international arena? Is it truly necessary? And more generally, does it really bear the risk of excessive intervention into one's private life on the side of the government? Vitaly Yefimovich, allow me to address this question to you first. Thank you. But I was brought up differently. We have gender equality now. No bias. I am rather conservative in this respect. I was not really prepared to speak on domestic and family violence straight away. I was planning to cover the topic of the permissibility of governmental interference into the private life more generally. So speaking on this issue, I have to admit that the very phrasing suggested by an old friend of mine, Professor Kazachenko, is not really suitable. It is impractical today and in its essence just naive. He speaks of legal mechanisms necessary to prevent any abuse or interference into one's private life. But having worked in law enforcement my entire life, I think that this is impossible and impractical, and the government will always be objectively limited in the mechanisms limiting its own power, including its power to interfere into one's private life in all imaginable spheres, technological, technical, and most importantly, political. I mean that, and this relates more to the topic of domestic violence, which you have described so correctly and so interestingly. I mean that the answer to the question of where the boundary between justified interference into family matters, that is, the necessity to fight this domestic violence as a precedent, and the methods that the government uses, lies. This is a complex, multifaceted problem. Me and my doctorate student, Yulia Sluchevskaya, who is also present here today, recently published a paper on the advantages and disadvantages of the legislation. I do not share the views of our wonderful deputy chairman of State Duma, Tolstoy, who I have known for a long time, and I can say that we think in different directions. The matter is that he is a man of his office and cannot just suddenly claim it should be written in the constitution that the legislation breaks up the family. These were the exact words, I believe. Our situation is somewhat different. I'm sorry, but I'm going to add a couple of words. Not so much for all the participants, but for Charlotte in particular. The crux of the matter is that there are many factors involved: historical and cultural, mental, legal, and judicial factors that condition the stage we are in, 16th, 17th century, as compared to European countries, to the so-called Western values, which are, as a matter of fact, realized in such countries as the USA, Japan, and others. You have just mentioned, and Charlotte too, as much as I understand, the innovations made in foreign countries in this respect. And it has just occurred to me, it just happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. I have been visiting and studying Japan for the past 10 years. I have been researching it profoundly for a long while now, and I have to say that the concept of domestic violence is alien to Japan, but I, as much as any other outsider in Japan, is sometimes shocked and even annoyed by the attitude to children in Japan. They think in Japan that limiting a child in any possible way is a mortal sin. And before children go to school, they can do as they please. And Now, the country where it is unthinkable to even as much as touch a child enacts in a legislation prohibiting any form of violence towards a child. This is the point where Japan stands. In relation to Japan, we stand on the opposite pole. Legally, turbulence and chaos reign supreme in our tundra. What our legislation claims in different areas and respects you might very well know. As concerns limiting the interference into one's family life from the technical point of view, which is closer to me, it is closer to me because, sadly, in my family, I am practically the only man. And I am surrounded by women. I have daughters and granddaughters. All my family is predominantly female, which is why I sometimes personally experience domestic violence. And as a representative of the law enforcement, I have two questions directly related to the topic. So first, is our society actually ready and prepared to apply to domestic agencies for protection in family matters and resolving issues of domestic violence? If, for example, in the USA, the court issues a ruling that prohibits the husband to approach his wife within a 10-meter distance, and I know that what it is like, because I lived and worked in America for a long time and had witnessed it many times, and if the husband breaks this rule, he will be immediately cuffed and arrested. Everything is very serious there, no problem at all. There arises a very serious problem, people's trust in law enforcement agencies, which have to interfere and protect the interests of the woman or man who is supposed to be the victim of domestic violence. So, are the citizens ready to appeal to agencies? The second question is, are the law enforcement agencies prepared within the constraints of their payroll, their usual workload and everything, realize these functions as well? We are all very familiar with the practice of refusing to institute criminal proceedings. Well, the reasons are clear. The wife makes a complaint, then tomorrow she withdraws it, and then the day after tomorrow she makes it again. So, the law enforcement agencies can also be understood here. Your question, Ekaterina, was more specific, I believe, and I'm trying to cover the whole panel, the outer perimeter of the problem area itself. You have, principally, fully answered my question, and I will ask my colleagues to formulate specific questions connected with what you have already touched upon. We do have trust issues. Firstly, citizens mistrust law enforcement agencies. As a lawyer, I often face clients, women mainly, but also men, children, elderly people, no limits here, who have suffered any form of domestic violence. Physiological, psychological, psychological, economic, or all forms combined, and they come to me with a complaint that they appealed to law enforcement agencies and they were rejected. Law enforcement agencies consist of people who have a certain cultural code, mentality and perception, and they often consider such claims an abuse and manipulation on the side of the victim, or they do not have any legal grounds to interfere. However, there's an exemplary case that was considered by the European Court of Human Rights this year and attracted public attention to the problem of domestic violence in Russia as such. This is the case of Volodina versus Russian Federation, the first case of domestic violence to which the European Court of Human Rights reacted in a very certain way. It said that there are no legal preventive tools in the country itself or any tools that would provide any form of adequate response to the incident of domestic violence. Volodina had to leave Russia, change her name and residence, because her cohabitant partner, not even a husband, stalked, chased and abused her for several years.
Совершал все возможные формы насилия над ее ребенком, который был не от него, как формы нападения, хищения имущества,
various from theft to pathological cases of posting intimate photographs on the internet. But the law enforcement agencies only reacted to the latter, to posting intimate photographs on the internet. There's no article convicting a person for pornographic vengeance or anything similar in Russia, which is why the case was started on the ground of interference into the person's private life, not on the side of the government, but on the side of the cohabitant. The case led to nothing, actually, and the European Court of Human Rights, when analyzing the reaction of law enforcement agencies to the persons involved and the situation itself, stated that, unfortunately, we do not have the tools to react to the situations properly or adequately.
С этого и начался очередной виток обсуждения этой темы.
And this is how another round of discussion started over the topic. And I would like to address this question to Tatyana Bakuleva, since we have discussed this earlier on, about your attitude to the problem from the point of view of the criminal law, about your attitude to the issues already raised, and the attitude about your attitude to the draft legislation in the context of state interference into one's private matters. I can see that Charlotte is holding the microphone, so if you have anything to say before the speaker takes the floor, you are very much welcome.
Yes, before or after?
Yes, before or after. I cannot just monopolize this panel. But since you mentioned me, I would like to thank you for raising two very important questions, which are topical for France as well. Firstly, not only women, but also children can become victims of domestic violence and harassment. Men, too, suffer from this. Statistically, the risks of becoming victimized are higher for women than men.
Риск оказаться жертвой домашнего насилия гораздо выше, чем для мужчин. Недавно во Франции
Recently, in France, there has been a study conducted by the magistrate and the prosecutor's office, which covered 188 cases of domestic violence, 149 of which were violent acts committed against women.
145
145 of those who were guilty were
В
men.
большинстве случаев мы действительно фокусируемся на
And most of the cases we deal with involve women, but we have to remember that men can become victims of domestic violence as well.
И также, поскольку это вопрос,
This also concerns the issue of teaching, educating women in how to deal with the situations of domestic violence or sexual harassment. Let me give you a personal example.
Впервые 2 месяца
For the first time, 2 months ago, I was placed in the situation
жертвы.
of a victim. As
Я занимаюсь
a litigation associate in the white-collar and regulatory defense,
должностным
I
положением.
confronted the situation that I usually deal with at work. There was a man who would come and stay at my door.
К моей двери, он там спал.
He would come every day and he would sleep there.
Такое вот у него поведение было.
He was not actually homeless, but his behavior was deviant. He was not, you see, in front of the building. He stayed right in front of my own door on the 6th floor. So I suggested that I should call some social services and they would take care of him, would provide some accommodation, do something. So I didn't know what to do and I contacted the police. To my surprise, I faced many problems coming from female police officers in particular. Females' attitude was colder than males' attitude. And I went to the police and I still remember this police lady who asked me, "Don't you have a man or a dog?" And I said, "Do you mean I have to have a man or a dog to protect me? That is, I need a man just to protect myself?" So this was just shocking. Actually, we have many problems in France with the police too. Mine is not a serious case, but there are women in France who cannot file a criminal complaint, who cannot come to the police because the police would not accept it. They do not submit the files to the prosecutor's office. There has recently been a case with a woman who was put into custody because she filed a complaint for domestic violence. This is just unbelievable. So thank you for raising these issues. And I think this would serve as a good question for our open discussion. What measures do you think should be realized? In France, for instance, we raised the question of training police officers to be sensitive to these issues, of forming non-state organizations who could be stationed at and work with the police departments and help victims if need arises. We would welcome any suggestions from you, Tatyana.
Если необходимо. Поэтому, вы знаете, любые решения, любые вопросы мы будем приветствовать, если вы предложите.
Да, конечно.
Татьяна, пожалуйста.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to liven up the discussion a little, and it seems to me that we have been so far only canvassing the situation, and I would like the other speakers to try and draw the demarcating line between violence and non-violence, because this is a very thin line, and the cases we are describing are unprecedented. They are, in fact, unthinkable and unimaginable, and they have to be regulated, of course. But where exactly is that line that marks the case as domestic violence? please speak about this too. We are all lawyers, we are speaking about law and legislation, and we understand that any law or any legislation can exert either positive or negative influence, and I'm interested in the opinion of the speakers from that perspective. Thank you. Olga, I would then like to start with your question. In my legal practice, this has never been a question at all, whether it is domestic violence happening to a certain person. People never ask questions like these. This is why it seems to me that the victims of domestic violence always fully realize what has happened to them. That is, they realize that whatever is happening or has happened is bad. They know that something bad has happened. As concerns the draft legislation on family and domestic violence, there is will be a provision there in Article 2, if I'm not mistaken there, which states that it will protect the victim in cases not regulated by the Administrative or Criminal Code. In my opinion, these are precisely the cases where the victims of domestic violence have to be protected from this violence. There are grave cases that have been publicized with grievous bodily harm, hands chopped off and such like, lives taken. These cases deserve much closer attention, but victims have to be protected from crimes of moderate gravity too. Unfortunately, the draft clearly states in Article 2 that they will not be protected. As concerns my own attitude to the draft, it should be further moderated to turn it into an effective protection mechanism. It includes some interesting measures, including preventive measures, measures to be taken after the incident of violence has occurred, psychological measures, all very interesting. This is something new for the Russian legislation. A new demand coming from society. I would not call it a demand for governmental interference. I would call it a demand for protection coming from domestic violence victims, whoever they might be. As concerns my own legal experience in this sphere, I cannot but agree with my colleagues that mistrust towards law enforcement agencies is there, and it is hard to overcome. Then there is the problem of investigating such cases. There is no workable mechanism or methodology for investigation. Law enforcement agencies find it really problematic to investigate cases like these and instead work out ways to reject instituting criminal action. There are many cases like these. We clearly have to make efforts to change the attitudes towards the problem in question. The attitude of both the society and the law enforcement agencies. There is, of course, this attitude on the side of the latter that the problem is insignificant, not worth considering or wasting state resources on. The opinion is hard to agree with because home, which should be a person's comfort zone, turns into a battlefield. This is a large-scale problem, and there was a period in the history of Russian criminal law when the gravity of domestic violence as a crime was raised. This only concerned cases of domestic violence involving bodily harm. It became a graver crime and no longer a crime on a private charge by the initiative of the Supreme Court, but this norm existed on the private public plane for 7 months only, and then it was changed. How and why it is is hard to estimate precisely by the commentary to the law itself. The fact remains that the norm didn't stay long. However, there is a movement towards protecting the victims of domestic violence, and the legislation itself would testify to that. Generally, my attitude can be described as positive. It is indeed necessary, but the legislation itself has to be further elaborated on. Thank you very much. I want to elaborate on the question asked by Olga Savina. Tatyana has partially answered it. We, as lawyers, face these situations when we see people driven to extremes come to us, because we are not used to washing dirty laundry in public. And when the woman comes to a lawyer, she has no further doubts remaining about what exactly is happening to her, because she has come to see a professional lawyer. This is the state when a legal and other types of assistance are required. As for legal assistance, it is still not provided here in our country, and this is a sensitive and unpleasant moment connected with the attitude to psychological health in our country. It is not protected in any way, and we do not have a systemic psychological support for people who have been victimized. If a criminal act has been committed, and those criminal acts involve physical violence, it is qualified as such in the criminal code. I would like to pay your attention to the fact that the rhetoric over the legislation on preventing domestic and physical violence has been frightening in our country, where the argumentation itself is inappropriate, and we will discuss this later. The rhetoric does not allow for one very important factor, and we need to educate people on this point. When I say we, I mean those who support the concept of legislation, if not the legislation itself. We are considering prevention, and we have no viable system of measures that would effectively prevent the very appearance of domestic violence, and no administrative criminal code can help here, because they are by 99% aimed at reacting to crimes committed rather than preventing them. Hypothetically, fear of criminal or administrative proceedings can work as a prevention, but there's nothing else. And we are talking about the measures, the question that Charlotte asked, which social measures of whatever character, therapeutic, constructive or any other, can prevent the violence from taking place before handcuffs and incarceration come into play. I would like to ask Anna Rivina, as the head of one of the main centers here in Russia, a center which works with the problem of violence. This is the Center of Violence Now, which deals not only with family and domestic violence, but these cases are the primary focus. We are with Anna on first name terms, as we work in the same department, and I'm not going to camouflage our friendly relationship. Have you ever in your legal practice come across the necessity to define the case as violent or non-violent, the necessity that Olga has mentioned earlier, and how do you see the necessary measures? How do you treat the legislation itself? So, in continuation of our discussion, what do you think about these issues? Thank you very much. I wanted to say thank you specifically for raising the problem with a different audience, because it does indeed concern everyone, those of us who live in Russia and those of us who live abroad. I would start with the fact that the legislation itself reflects the demand coming from the society today. I wouldn't say that Russia is unique and we have this unique habit of never washing the dirty laundry in public. I have been helping victims of domestic violence for the past 5 years on a daily basis, and have also been explaining for these 5 years why the legislation against violence is necessary. We started talking about this before the decriminalization, and my colleagues have been working on this problem since the early 90s, and the decriminalization itself only revealed the necessity of the legislation itself. I treat the draft presented by the Federation Council very negatively for a very simple reason. From the legal perspective, it is absolutely meaningless. It is poorly written and does not address key points, but I would say that we have some legal norms we can base our work on. Why am I saying that Russia is not unique in this fight? It's because last year, it was only 40 years since the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women was instituted. Only 40 years since domestic violence has been brought into the world focus. This means that domestic violence has always been there and will stay there. The scope makes all the difference as well as the ways to react to it. I would also like to note that the fact that the USSR was one of the first countries to ratify it. It is also true that today the Istanbul Convention is the most progressive and effective mechanism in working with domestic violence. Last year, I was invited by the Council of Europe to write my course on adapting the existing legislation of Russia to the standards of the Istanbul Convention, and we were going around the country across different regions together with the Academy of Justice and explained it to our judges, prosecutors and lawyers that there is no working legal mechanics on fighting the problem, but the legal community knows how to resolve it. I can say that we also worked with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, retraining their employees, and we explained it to them what the Russian existing legislation is. And many policemen told us that they never knew this was a violation of human rights, and they didn't know this legislation could help them, and whether they needed it at all. The problem is complex and very sad, and I'm very grateful for the ability to discuss it like this, while our opponents, many as they may or may not be, are not even trying to discuss their opinions with the audience. The sociological surveys show that 75% of our citizens vote for the legislation and they feel the need for it. How does this relate to the topic being discussed? Government and private life. Where do the boundaries lie? Working with those who have suffered from domestic violence, we understand that the problem is recurring, and it is vital to understand that this problem is not limited to one woman or one family only. It is also the court level, the law enforcement level. I'm not only referring to those situations when we cannot help those who address their complaints to us because there are no viable effective mechanisms. The most high-profile cases taken by experts and specialists of my center, Alexei Parshin, the case of Margarita Gracheva, whose hands were chopped off, the case of the Khachaturian sisters, they all show that the problem is not only the legislation. It is also the people who refuse to admit that the problem exists. There's people who can influence the legislation, lawmaking, court decisions, whether they can see the problem. In the case of Margarita Gracheva, whose husband chopped off her hands, she actually had come to the police before, and it took the district officer 2 weeks to decide on giving corrective instructions. It took 4 times to persuade the judge to deprive the husband of his parental rights. The judge thought that there was no direct threat to the child, only to the mother. The same story happened with Alena Verba. Her husband stabbed her multiple times and left her alone with her child. Alena died, but the husband was never deprived of his parental rights. Again, the judge thought that there was no direct threat to the child, only to the mother. I do not know what to say to this. No legal or personal commentary ensues. I just cannot take it into my head. Why do we need legislation? We need it because the government has to stand up and state that the problem exists. Not because we are special, but because it exists in all countries and it has to be solved. Then there would be some measures taken to solve the problem. And undoubtedly, even if tomorrow we have a draft that will one day become law, the problem will not be solved overnight. We are now still at square one. We need to change our attitude towards the problem and really start solving it. Last year I was in Paris studying our colleagues' experience, and I learned that despite the restraining order ruling, the police are often reluctant to issue it. Not only do we have to institute this legislation, but we also have to admit and accept that the problem exists and then start solving it. I would like to conclude with a simple phrase: we can make sure that there is no violence in our life, but we never know whom our children fall in love with, and it may happen so that they come to the police with a complaint. They will be rejected with the phrase, "You are to blame for this," and this is terrifying. Thank you very much. Stories like these are plentiful in my practice too. They are all very different socially and economically, but the consequences are always the same. If the victim does not go all the way and does not keep complaining, then the violence either never stops or results in dire, unthinkable consequences. I want to ask Olga, as a practitioner who deals with arbitration disputes, not only as a mother or friend or family member, as a person who understands what a family is from the economic point of view, what cross risks are involved when bigger economic decisions are taken in the family. What do you think about the problem of domestic violence itself and its economic resonance, taking into account the legislation that might potentially influence the situation somehow? I'm sorry for the long introduction. Thank you, Ekaterina. It is indeed an interesting question. First of all, what shocked me in these two stories were the years, 15 and 25. I can't imagine this. I really have to apologize for potentially saying something that might resonate. I do not quite understand the motivations of these women. It is more understandable in the second case, if we consider these economic reasons, due to which this woman doesn't want to change anything at the given moment, or rather wants to, but she is not ready to. In the first case, we have a certain perception, particular to a certain social stratum, which presupposes that a woman within these 15 years is not ready to change anything. Domestic violence presupposes a changeable situation, an outbreak followed by peace, followed by another outbreak. To me personally, it is not quite clear why women behave the way they do for 15, 20 years, 25 years. Answering your question about the family economic makeup, I have been a practicing lawyer for many years, and I started, as many did, with civil and family cases. This area just never became my primary working focus. But what I can see in business now, there are many women coming to me with complaints from the business environment. It is rather a trend, a fad in the business world today to pass the shares over to children, a business share to children, to provide for their future wealth. Here, I frequently come across cases where the women's rights are again infringed upon. Husbands often perceive the situation in a similar manner. Even if I pass something over to my wife, it will be done with certain limitations. Economically, there is a certain degree of dependency within the family, which in turn influences the woman's attitude to domestic violence as such. I might sound repetitive, but again, violence can take all different forms. There are gruesome cases of hands being chopped off, yes, sadly, but it always starts with minor issues. If a man hits his wife even once when she comes home smelling of alcohol, even if it happens for the first time, she has to turn around and leave right away. But again, we now resemble football fans watching a match. We are perfect commentators and advisors when it does not concern us directly. As concerns economics and the recommendations I could give to women, you really should not consider any economic issues, like New Year celebrations of fur coats or cars. If you feel violated in any possible manner, then it has to be resolved immediately. As concerns the draft legislation, I will take only a minute to express my view in this open discussion. I'm interested, and there may be some preventive measures written out in this legislation. I'm awfully sorry not to be properly acquainted with the draft itself, but I can definitely relate to what Charlotte has said earlier. And I definitely agree to the fact that we have to create some preventive measures that will ensure the very feeling of being protected. Being protected not by the law itself. I believe we are not being honest with ourselves when we say that there will be a legislation that will protect us all. I'm talking of social measures aimed at ensuring the feeling of being protected. It is more interesting, and I'm not negating the importance of a legislation here. The society parallel to that has to pay attention, not only formally, but actually. Thank you, Vitaly Efimovich. I would just like to add a couple of words to what you have said in the end of your speech, which was very interesting, regarding the idea of a woman immediately leaving and so with that becoming economically and financially independent. Life may be more complicated than that. I wanted to speak about the measures that we call preventive. The measures we touched upon at the very beginning, with the fear of sounding immodest. In 1992, Russian television services commissioned me to shoot a film about protecting victims of domestic violence in America. This film still exists. It has been shown several times on TV. It is, of course, outdated today, but is still kept by the channel. And one of the things shown there is the simplest measure we do not have. It is shelters. That is elementary places where the victimized woman can at least hide at the very beginning. The question of physical protection, not only psychological, not only psychiatric, but physical protection is very important too. This is where it starts. Do you agree? Yes, I absolutely agree. Instituting the legislation, we will have concrete measures, we will have words, but we do not have the tools. I absolutely agree. This is the basics that we should have. Of course, moreover, even creating the legislation and instituting it, it is undoubtedly necessary. We will still not have the necessary pool of measures because we will still depend on the mentality of the legislator, and the mentality of the upper circles that take the decisions, and they will be unable to reverse their opinions. They will still believe it is normal to administer beatings within the family. The examples given by Ekaterina illustrate the present situation very well. I'm sorry. I just like the speech very much, which is why I just wanted to comment on the ideas. Thank you. Yes, Charlotte. Thank you. I have two comments.
Вы знаете, у меня два комментария, поэтому
the issues you have mentioned are essential.
Существенные.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Sorry. Is that you can have
the best law in the world, but if you cannot effectively implement it, then there is nothing. It's nothing.
it's an issue
It is important in any kind of law. I specialize more in anti-money laundering, and we can talk about the financial issues and the financial task force, but one of the cornerstones will be effective implementation by cultures.
Эффективная имплементация в любой стране. Но
But for the effective implementation, you need money. And basically, the state has to allocate a certain amount, make a conscious decision to allocate a certain amount of money to fight this issue. Recently in France, our Prime Minister gave a speech and said that the government will allocate 1 billion euros to resolve this problem alone. It is a lot, and it is not everywhere that such an amount is affordable, but this is a conscious decision, a policy to start and focus on this issue. It is very important in such cases. Ekaterina, you said that the women didn't know, and mostly many women do not know. They don't know what the procedure is that they should follow. They don't know where they should go because they don't trust the police. Sometimes they don't trust doctors. And in some countries, doctors can be subject to professional secrecy, so they cannot report the case to the police. In Spain, because Spain is always cited as an example in Europe in terms of fighting and preventing domestic violence, Spain has advanced legislation in this respect, and they also have quite interesting measures and tools. But the doctors are obligated to report serious and repeat cases of domestic violence to the police. Interesting tools that have been implemented recently include, for example, a smartphone application for women, where in the application they can find all the information on the procedure, on the contacts, on the telephone numbers they should call, and also what kind of measures they should be asking for from police officers, from prosecutors, from judges, for example, protective order, which is very important. In Europe, also thanks to the Istanbul Convention, there's the telephone helpline that works 24/7, 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. It can also prevent repeat crimes. Because it all starts with minor offenses. Then it goes on and on and on. So maybe you could comment more on what kind of tools are available and possible, and also I'm not a Russian person, and I was lucky enough, as Ekaterina said, to have a worker in our office who follow all the discussions and how the legislation develops. But since I do not have all the information on this, I would like to know what sanctions there are considered by the Russian government. What kind of punishment the Russian government considers possible? I would like to comment on several statements here. As concerns the economic component, I would like to say that there are concrete figures today for Europe. Sadly, in Russia we do not have any information on the amount of victims. It has already been proven, mathematically calculated, that it is more expedient to prevent the crime rather than deal with its consequences. When we hear someone say that the legislation is quite costly to introduce, we need to state that it is much cheaper to provide physical and psychological protection or issue a restraining order before the government has to keep perpetrators in detention. Children in orphanages pay hospital bills, pay sick leaves, which is also economically binding for the employer. Secondly, concerning the mobile app, I want to boast a mobile app, first mobile app our organization created in 2016 for victims of domestic violence. We gathered a database in all the crisis centers we have in Russia. Today the figure is strikingly low, numbering only 200, and this is by no means sufficient. In Sweden, for example, with a population of 10 million people, there are 200 crisis centers, and the figure is sufficient. In Moscow, with its official population of more than 10 million people, there is one state crisis center, which, by the account of its director, is almost always half empty, not because there are no victims, but because the state has a monopoly on information in this respect, and it informs people very badly on the possibility itself. And then, as a head of a non-profit, I have to spend my company's finance on informing people of the state-funded options. Then, because it's a governmental structure, it is also very bureaucratic and can only accept women who hold the papers, official papers proving their victim status. Yes, they have to have registered their complaint first. Then there is a further complication. These centers only help women in financial distress. But if the husband beating his wife makes a lot of money, then the family is considered to be wealthy, and consequently the woman doesn't need any assistance. Yes, exactly. There's a dead body will come and register it. That there was this awful case. Yana Savchuk was killed in the city of Orel in 2016 when she was calling the police, and the district police officer said that there's a dead body will come and register it. Her father 2 weeks ago received a compensation of 100,000 rubles, about $1,500 for the life of his own daughter, and the Internal Affairs refused to admit their own fault, saying that he as a father had to do something about that, find a solution, and then probably go to prison under Article 105, which is murder, because you have to have either a husband or a dog that have to protect you. Yes, because you have to have either a husband or a dog. I greatly respect the crisis center that opened 5 years ago in Moscow and has been helping some women, but it makes me indignant to hear the cases when a woman comes to my non-profit that does not have any direct finance and says, I applied for help to the state crisis center because my husband beat me severely, and they said because I have Moscow registration, they have to hold a meeting to decide whether I'm eligible for assistance. Why should I take the extra effort to call Oksana Pushkina, a deputy of the Russian Duma, so that she calls the center and asks them to please perform their duties? I'm very happy that we agree on the point of the legislation not being sufficient, but it might help and prescribe a certain amount of help centers and the liability for rejecting to help. Because besides the legislation, we also need people to understand that violence is far from acceptable. Thank you, Tatyana. I would like to add, since I have the microphone, it has been mentioned before, but still, the issue of the women living after she has experienced violence is very topical. Practically every woman coming for help says, where should I go? This is no secret. 10 or 15 years or more. They have nowhere to go. The centers only appeared a while ago. And only 10 years ago, there were no addresses that women could go to. Now there are some centers, but still very few. Then, the measures that Charlotte has outlined, the protective measures, exist in Russia too. There are measures, they are not so bad, but they do not work because of the attitude, both of the victims themselves and the law enforcement agencies. They do not treat the situation seriously enough. An interesting issue that Anna has raised. The father had to protect his daughter. The law enforcement agencies said the father had to help. Morally, of course, the strong would protect the weak, but legally, it would be a punishable offense. So the law would be against any such behavior. This leads us to the conclusion that the present state of affairs is far from being good. What I like, however, is that we have started this discussion, that there is a draft writing out the liabilities, which means that we will be working with the problem further on. Thank you. We really hope so. Before we let our audience take part in the discussion and ask their questions, I already have a note with a question and an offer to speak on a topic related to our discussion. I would like to say the following. I head the Department of Family Law and I teach family law. I read lectures and give tutorials, and it was in this capacity that I had an interesting experience which left an indelible impression on me. I would like to share it here because Couple of Readings is also an academic conference, among other things. A group of 4-year students, 19, 21 years old, were discussing a simple, formal topic of raising children and performing parental duty, which is really a very interesting discussion topic for a group. It became interesting when we digressed to the possibility of any form of upbringing being admissible, applicable, normal, what violence is towards children in the family, and whether many traditional Russian forms of upbringing can be classified as violence. I was shocked by the reaction of the audience, because the class turned into a sort of group therapy. I asked my students how many of them believed that physical forms of upbringing, physical punishment in raising children inside a family, normal. The question logically followed a certain case. 20 out of 30 students in the classroom, and I called Anna as a specialist in domestic violence issues. She was at university at the moment. 20 students claimed that punishment is admissible and possible. One of the girls sitting at the front desk was awed by the rhetoric and asked the others, how can you say such things? My father used to beat me. I'm not 20 and I still cannot bring myself to talk with him. She was so moved that she could not keep silent, and when she started talking, everybody started talking too. And I never meant this class to be an exorcism seance. I asked my students the question without obliging them to answer, but I asked them if they were subjected to physical forms of punishment. And out of 20 people who found physical forms of punishment in the family admissible, these were the same 20 students. The stories they shared to justify physical forms of punishment were as follows. A girl was jumping on the sofa and disturbing her granddad who was watching TV. The parents reprimanded her twice and she still didn't listen. Her parents lifted her up from the sofa by the ear, tore the ear, and the girl learned not to jump on the sofa when her granddad was watching TV. She, as a grown-up, claimed that this was normal, that she was only 4 years old at the time, that she didn't obey otherwise, and that she was content since then. Then there were boys from the East who were raised in deep respect for the older generation, irrespective of the context, who said that a single look cast by their father had to discipline the child no matter what. Another student was a son of an Afghan veteran who did not beat him, but communicated with him and his younger brother in such a way that they could not leave the room for several days after they had in some way disappointed him. The boy said, "I would prefer him to have punished us physically rather than forbear with the psychological violence." And we very well understood that it was psychological violence, although we were just schoolboys back then, and we understood that something in our family was definitely going wrong. So another important issue that we didn't have enough time to consider within the time limits of our panel is that violence does not only concern women, but very frequently children, and takes terrible forms. And often violence against a woman is connected with violence against children. This is what I would like to talk about, if there's a possibility. I can see, Anna, that you have picked up the microphone. Be brief if possible, because I was referring to the note, and I would like to give the floor to the audience too. We have a professional mediator present here today, and I would like to listen to their opinion. Just one sentence. I just wanted to say why domestic violence has to be studied separately is because psychology in this respect cannot function without law, and the opposite is true too. In the majority of cases, violence exists in families where it passes from generation to generation and ultimately becomes a model. It becomes an important psychological defense mechanism for these 20 children and for millions of other children around the world. The role of the victim is very unpleasant, and if the person says, "I have deserved it," they pretend to be in control, sitting pretty rather than admit that they could not influence the situation, so everything is perfectly explicable. And a final thought to continue from what Anna has said. When I asked these children, do you still think that the violence you experienced was justified and normal? They said, "Why domestic violence? We never experienced domestic violence." And all the 20 of them said that when they were beaten, when their ears were being torn off, and so on, this was not in fact violence, but a physical form of education, not necessarily punishment. In other words, except the term domestic violence itself, because bearing the status of the victim and extrapolating the situation onto one's own person is very unpleasant, which is also a reason why some women never complain. Well, I would just like to add that it's necessary to give access to information so that the people can recognize violence. That's the most important thing, not to deal with existent problems, but to prevent them. I want to thank all the moderators. My name is Olga Savina. I am the director of the Ural Center for Mediation. I'm a professional mediator, and I have been settling disputes and resolving conflicts, including family conflicts and also importantly criminal cases involving juveniles. I would like to cite some statistics, and I would like the moderators to react if they have time. There's the notion of psychological violence, which is in no way identified in criminal law. And in the examples that you gave today, the juveniles definitively experienced their psychological violence, but because it is not clearly written out in the law, the judge did not deprive the offender of his parental status and rights. I wanted to also speak about a different situation. When a couple divorces, they have to protect the interests of their children by law. They, in fact, become aggressors towards them. And the psychological violence against against juveniles is very powerful. The teenagers become traumatized as they see their whole world collapsing without any prior notice. And I know that in many countries, parents have to prepare their children for the coming divorce. In Russia, sadly, we do not have a system like this. Then the child becomes a tool and weapon in the hands of their parents as they fight each other. What happens next? Teenagers try to escape the psychological violence. Where do they escape? To the streets, among other places. When juvenile crimes are investigated, among the underlying reasons and prerequisites for committing a felony, psychological violence comes to the forefront. Psychological violence that the child experienced in the family. Psychological violence can be seen when the child feels unwanted, when he or she does not interest the parents, when they feel that the parents use them as a tool. Teenagers would leave for those places where they can feel needed and valued, any kind of social grouping, since it's impossible to be on their own in this age. So they lean towards any form of communication. Secondly, the child does not feel being protected by the family in this situation, and he or she will be blamed rather than understood or protected. All these are indicators of psychological violence, which unfortunately are not written out or identified anywhere. And thus there is no psychological help provided for the teenagers. At the same time, they are afraid of losing the family, and they are trying to justify and protect the family, as Ekaterina rightly said. The consequences are both social and material when the child has to accept the situation of a heavy financial burden and becomes a certain trophy, not because of their human characteristics, but because they carry with them a certain material capital that can attract other people. I'm not talking about women, only about children. When the parents willingly or unwillingly become bullies, very aggressive bullies, because children cannot protect themselves from their parents. Dear moderators, if you have anything to say to that, I would be grateful. On the 18th, 19th of February, the European Union will be holding a seminar here, a seminar on interagency cooperation in reacting to violence and preventing it. And of course, it would be great to have the benefit of your opinion then. Thank you very much. Anna Rivina will be taking part in the seminar, so you will also have a chance to communicate there too. Charlotte, could you comment on the issues of violence against children that Olga has dwelled upon? I would also be thankful if other participants express their opinion on this later too.
Thank you
very much for a very interesting and important comment. I think we have two situations here. We have the kids who are inside the family, where the parents are divorcing. So, the question is whether the government should interfere at this stage or not. Maybe they are not the victims of domestic violence, but later, as you said, they can be weapons. They can become weapons that parents use against each other. And in the case where during divorce, where there is domestic violence, there is a victim, there is an offender. And the victim, for instance, the mother, refers the case to the prosecution. And if the victim goes to the police, to court, and then At least in France, there are some measures that special judges prescribe. I do not know what courts deal with divorce proceedings in Russia, but in France, we have special courts and special measures for that. The judge can issue a restrictive order, but not because of the divorce itself, but because of the violence. The judge also has to act within 6 days and decide where to place this family, to find another location, to find another home for the family, then also to find some financial aid for the family for 3 years. And this all happens thanks to the law that was relatively recently implemented in France in 2014. We also have these electronic bracelets that prevent the offender, be it the father or the mother, because the man of the family can also become a victim of domestic violence, prevent them from approaching the victims. The mother and the child, for example. Of course, in such situations, there are measures that have to be taken and they have to be implemented. Thank you. Olga will also comment on this. I understand that formally this session has come to an end, and we will give the microphone to the audience for about 5 minutes and we'll be finishing then. I will literally take a minute of your attention. I think that in the situation you have described, and in many situations involving children, our tutorship and guardian agency acts too formally. We have to start with that. There are no psychologists in the trial. This is not norm, but it has to exist. So if tutorship and guardian agencies do not work the way they usually do, just quickly taking the child away from their family, but will protect their interests, we can potentially rebalance the situation towards a more positive outcome. To add to that, I was protecting the interests of the Prokazov's family, whose parental rights were about to be revoked for taking their child to a demonstration. I'm not going to go into details of this abominable case, but among other things, the agencies were trying to deprive them of their parental rights to the 1.5-year-old child, breastfed at the time. So tutorship and guardian agencies found no opportunity, despite the case being exceptionally high profile, to appear in court, providing neutral characteristics for the participants of the case. Which is why I totally agree, Olga. Dear colleagues, we need to finalize our panel, but I would still like to hear out a couple of questions from the audience. Raise your hands. There's a microphone in the audience. Yes, please. Elena Yulova and partners. Thank you. I would like to ask a question to the representatives of Mediation Center and you too, as practicing lawyers in such cases. What do you think about our government introducing the Institute of Reconciliation in civil cases? But still, who is the reconciliator and who is to be the judge? Retired judges. What do you think about the idea of recommending our principals to go to the mediation center so that they can solicit help from a psychologist also? Because even in settlement agreements, in family disputes, or in discontinuation of criminal cases, all these are still controlled by the court. So there is no assistance seen. In criminal cases, there's punishment, and in family disputes, a formal approach to handling childcare. Just very quickly,
Очень быстро.
as for mediation,
Что касается медиации, это
this
очень
is a
важный
very
вопрос.
important issue.
Во
In
Франции,
France, in criminal cases and cases of domestic violence, these cases are completely opposed to mediation.
в данном случае
So this is out of the question because there is a certain lack of balance,
потому что
basically between the victim and the person
некоего баланса
who is the offended party in a civil case.
жертвой и
Mediation is therefore applicable only to civil cases, but not to criminal cases.
применимо к гражданским делам, но не к криминальным, не к уголовным делам.
себе тоже прокомментировать.
As a lawyer, I can also comment on this.
Во-первых, медиация,
Although mediation has been slowly but steadily developing in Russia, it is still quite a rare way of settling disputes.
способом урегулирования споров, в семейных
In family disputes, I totally agree with Charlotte. It is a very complicated issue because equality that exists by default disappears if we talk about conflicts with domestic violence. And then in these conflicts, mediation is not always a priority in settling this dispute because it happens often that in such cases, reconciliation means that the victim returns to the same environment. Secondly, legal implications are not yet in agreement with the procedural law, even if we do not refer to the criminal cases mentioned by Charlotte. And although this can function as a rite of execution, even court decisions are executed very poorly. The situation with alternative dispute settlements is even worse. Which means a good? Any, if they justify the end of preserving a family, if the situation allows for it. And if not, then it brings us back to the same difficulties we have already outlined. One sentence, if I may. The task of a mediator in family disputes is not to reconcile the family, but to help them find a mutually acceptable way out of the situation within current legislative boundaries. Answering the question, the mediator has no right to provide other services, including legal and psychological services, which is why we do not provide psychological services to the parties. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have no time left, even for any single extra question. Thank you again for coming here today. Thank you, panel experts, and my co-moderator. It has been very interesting and useful. We have enjoyed it, and we hope you have so too. Good day to all.